Hello City Builders, this is Hubbub recording for you from the city of Nuvo Springs on the Azure Gulf map in the Sunset Harbor DLC. Today I want to do a kind of a show and talk video. Full disclosure, sometimes I just kind of get tired of taping. I'm not the best narrator, but then also sometimes what happens is I just dive into something and I go and I go and I go. And then I realize, wait, I should record this. And I am not in the mood for deleting what I've just spent 3 hours working on and doing it over. So, but then the other reason that I want to do this is I think it'll be a more effective method of presentation because it could take 3 or 4 videos to do this as a let's play or even with time lapse. Some time ago, I put in this little rinky-dink island industrial port, which my understanding is actually there are a couple places in the world that work like this, but I've never thought of this as being very realistic, and certainly not what I've done with the rail and the roads here, the bridges across the water. It's not an inefficient little facility, but it's always been kind of an eyesore as this city has continued to develop. And so I have been thinking to myself, what is a great city without a great industrial port and some shipyards to go along with? So I've been doing a little bit of research. I've been looking at different examples of shipyards and ports around the world and in the United States, and I'll look at those here in a second. So I was looking at several different shipyards and also ports, and it's really kind of fascinating. There's a couple things that are worth noticing about all of these. This is Newport News, which is in the US a very famous, long-standing historical shipyard. A lot of the ships that we floated in World War II were built in this shipyard, and this is located on the Chesapeake or inside the Chesapeake. Also, Daewoo in South Korea has some really impressive shipyards here. To some extent, this informs how I've approached this build as well. So the two things that immediately jumped out at me when I looked at these was because in the game city Skylines, we are generally discouraged from placing residential areas too close to industrial pollution forming areas. And so the first thing I couldn't help noticing with all of these is their relatively close proximity to residential suburbs. Here we have Newport News, and this has a pretty impressive rail yard that flanks it and borders it. So to some extent, there's a buffer here between the shipyard and the residential neighborhoods. Bollinger is down in Louisiana. These are some pretty extensive shipyards. You can see how much they've dug out of these canals in order to build in this facility. And then Ingalls Shipbuilding also. Now wait, let me back this up. So this one does not look... Bollinger does not look like it's in close proximity to residential. At least you can't see much. There's a marina right there. If we pull it out... So they're really out there right on the coast. But then Ingalls is right here. And here we have loads of residential just across the river. And then Daewoo, I think Daewoo is fairly well insulated. But here's an entire city actually. So all of these shipyards are not necessarily in game scale too far removed from residential neighborhoods. And then the other thing that's worth noticing for the sake of the game is all of these have some measure of protection from storm surges, from tides. Daewoo is built back into this little harbor, and you can see we have these land land features, promontories that are pushing out, that are providing some protection. Let's see. Newport News is tucked all the way up or south. I don't know if I have my compass turned around properly. Here we go. On the southern tip of the Chesapeake, but still pulled back inside, looks like a tributary, or part of the delta of the Chesapeake. And then let's see, Bollinger. Well, Bollinger's right on the coast, but as we said, now what's interesting about Bollinger is they are right up on the coast. They're built back a little bit, but they also have the protection. I think if we go in close enough, they're on the other side of the beach here, so they've got some, I don't know, is this marsh, swampland, barrier, reef islands, giving them some protection as well. So all of these shipyards have a significant amount or some amount of protection from the ocean itself to create a more hospitable building environment for shipbuilding. And then I also looked at some ports. Here's the port of Seattle. Also itself pulled back a little bit with a little bit of protection, but certainly closer to, no wait, I'm sorry, if we pull back out significantly, we can see it's tucked way back in this delta system here. And then the port of LA is right on the coast. We can see, but LA doesn't get much in the way of really serious storms the way they do on the East Coast or in the western half of the Pacific. So less protection, but a more hospitable climate and location here. Port of Rotterdam is also tucked back in. My goal with this port build then has been to make it as realistic as possible, as functional as possible, and as aesthetic as possible. In terms of realism, you can see now compared to the other these examples that we just looked at, it is right on the coast, so it's not perfectly realistic, but you know, not unlike the Port of LA. So on the realism front, we can see that for the most part, it's not entirely unrealistic. The Port of LA is right on the coast. Typically, you don't see shipyards, or at least the examples I looked at, you don't see shipyards co-located with a port. Usually the shipyards are located somewhere else. I thought about trying to locate these shipyards somewhere on the interior bay. The main problem here, though, is this bridge system, which I just don't want to have to mess with. I could try to find a raising bridge on the workshop. I could try to make this a tunnel system instead, but I do have the monorail crossing through here as well. Functionally, it wouldn't make a difference because the ships, when they finish building, they just vanish, and the revenue shows up on your balance sheet. So it's not like you would see ships trying to roll out into the water and then sail off. But I just didn't want to have to mess with trying to locate those in here. And that's also partly because I have other plans for this entire space here. But as far as the port is concerned, I don't think its placement is entirely unrealistic. I tried to locate these in a way that I'm giving some deference to what we're seeing in real life terms. The Ingalls shipbuilding, I believe, was right on the coast and was only protected by a barrier island. Newport News is located further inland. But the Azure Gulf map already featured this abutment or little land bridge that's poking out into the bay. And so this was an easy way for me to just kind of raise and level this up a little bit and keep the battlements where they were, and then locate the shipyards right here. I put in this flood wall to kind of redirect the stream so that it wouldn't be washing over and flooding the shipyards. So where the rail is concerned, some viewers might say, good grief, that's not realistic at all, this little whip around. I will point out that I've tried to be somewhat respectful, and I have the speed limit on this slowed down significantly. There might also be some objection to all the elevated rail, although I've tried to keep it as much to a minimum as I can. And if you notice, I'm really kind of proud of this spur here because it actually maintains level altitude. It leaves the ground here and maintains its level as it cuts across the yard over to this hub right here. So at least I've been able to keep the inclines as smooth as possible and the level of the rail pretty consistent. Although I fully understand that some people might say that's not realistic at all. You just wouldn't see this much elevated rail in a shipyard or industrial area at all. Let's see. So that's realism. From a functional standpoint, there's a couple purposes that I'm trying to accomplish here. One is this bigger picture issue of dealing with commercial happiness and productivity. Commercial zones tend to be less happy, partly because they're generating noise that makes them unhappy, partly because commercial zones are competing with unique buildings and parks for tourists, and so often they don't have as many customers as they would like to have. And so one of my objectives with this whole build was to rectify an imbalance in my oil and ore industry operations and bring in sufficient revenue to drop the tax rates on commercial down as low as I possibly could get them in order to float the happiness on commercial up above 80. Now, with respect to what's going on in the ore and oil industries, what's happening is this is pretty well in balance. Previously, I did not have enough special goods production, and it's still importing but exporting a heck of a lot of ore and oil, just raw resources. And so I'm not maximizing my profit there because obviously I'm not going to make as much money just exporting oil as I would exporting special goods or finished goods. So, and then we can look at, so here we see not a bad imbalance. Yes, I'm importing a little bit more than I am exporting, but I am converting all of that into metal and glass. Similarly with oil, kind of the same problem here. Again, good. I'm importing more than I'm exporting in terms of raw resource. And that means that everything I produce is going into production of plastics and petroleum. And so I am maximizing the revenue that I can generate in both of these industries. So the oil industry is pulling over 150,000 at the very least, and the ore industry is regularly turning a profit. Although it's obviously the big moneymaker here is oil, and then a lot of stuff ends up in unique factories and warehouses because a lot of what I produce ends up going to storage facilities so that it can be used in the production of unique goods. But that's part of what's going on here. So that functionally what I'm doing is constructing 3 different zones. From left to right, we have forestry here that is producing plain timber for use at the shipyards. And then we have ore, which is producing metal and glass, because I'm pretty sure both of those are in use. Yes, for the shipyards. And then finally my oil here is only producing plastics, which we saw right here. So I have production of all the special goods that are needed to make these ships that are ending up in these warehouses. Let me think. But also those special goods are going to be exported for revenue if they're not used here. And so that's the functional piece. From left to right, we have forestry, then ore, and then oil. And then I've also tried to be methodical from interior to import-export zones where we have our storage of raw goods tucked back in the facility. So there may be some debarkation of ore and oil from this cargo hub. There even could be some trains bringing cargo to this hub or this one. But the raw resources are tucked back. And then the next layer out, we have special goods. So we have metal and glass being produced on this side. We have plain timber being produced over here. And then finally we have plastics being produced here. Now, not as an afterthought, but I was still trying to rectify this imbalance that I mentioned previously. I do have some petroleum producers over here, and then we're storing that in these facilities right here. And so that as the production chain goes, finished goods end up closest to the points of embarkation. And so what we have there is 2 cargo hubs that are functional. This one and this one. And what's really kind of interesting here is this one seems to be managing most of the overland truck traffic, and this one seems to be managing most of the train traffic. They are both debarking and receiving ships. These two are here mostly for aesthetic purposes. The game isn't going to utilize them because the game algorithm is going to identify the most efficient trips when a journey spawns, and so there's always 1 or 2 facilities that are just completely ignored by the game once it figures out which facilities are most efficient. And so I found these really cool looking ploppable cargo ships in the workshop that are taking up space here to add to the visuals. But the only ports that are actually functioning here, or the hubs, are this hub and this. Let me think. So that's the functional piece. Now, as I said, I did add these petroleum producers over here. I also, for the sake of variety, added some fish, anchovy, 2 anchovies, because the shellfish is just too big to fit here. So I've got 2 anchovies ports right here, sending ships all the way over here to harvest. And then I did add a fish factory. Now, one of the issues with the fishing industry is there are no storage facilities. So this guy runs out, he sits there, and he waits and waits and waits until he gets the delivery. So we have those 2 facilities right there. Lastly, I want to talk about aesthetics. One of the things, I think it's, in some ways, it's kind of ironic because the game is so beautiful, but when you're talking about an industrial area, you're talking about a certain amount of dirt and grime and run-downness that's going on. So we do have these industrial parks that we picked up in the Steam Workshop. As best I can, so I'm using some of the Surface Painter tool to put in actual quote-unquote ruined terrain in some parts of this, but we do have a lot of concrete painted in to add to the aesthetics. I always think it looks pretty cool no matter what, but lots of container props and container parks, which also adds to the realism. I found this asset in the workshop. It's I think it's a logistics warehouse is the name of this. So we've got logistics warehouse back, logistics warehouse front. That's by Ronix69. And this is really cool. Part of the reason I put this in here was not so much for the industry that it produces, but I'm naming it the Nouveau Springs Port Authority, so it looks kind of like a central management building. And that's about it, I think. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I have done a little bit of modification as we went along. This hub right here was positioned too far this way, and I had ships clipping through the key and this port here. And so I did a little bit of work to move this further over to the left. So I don't know that I want to waste viewers' times waiting for a ship to arrive, but when those ships come in, they're not clipping anymore. They're coming straight into that port. These I found on the workshop also, so these are not vanilla cargo ships. I think they look absolutely stunning. I do also want to notice Avanya's warehouses. These are some pretty awesome looking warehouses. I got tired of the vanilla or the DLC warehouses. I love them. They're beautiful, but they're boring after a while. So it was nice to find these warehouses on the workshop. And I placed them back here, even though I described my conceptual theme the way I did, just because they kind of match these two here. So they're smaller versions of these two here. But that's it, everybody. That's the industrial port in Nuevo Springs. Okay, so I think I fairly well covered the realism component, the functionality component, and the aesthetics component. I'm really happy with how this port has turned out. Overall, I'm proud of and pleased with this build. So I think that's it for now. I want to thank you very much for watching. This is a different kind of video than most people might do. I just, I got into it and I immersed myself. I go down these rabbit holes, and before I knew it, I built it and I hadn't videotaped a thing. So I apologize to the viewer about that, but I'm really happy with the outcome. So thanks so much for watching. This is Hubbub signing off.